What is in a name? For most of us, it is an identity, a label given to us at birth. But throughout history, certain names have become something else entirely. They have become curses. They have become shorthand for depravity, for madness, for a cruelty so profound it stains the very pages of history. And no name echoes with the specter of sexual tyranny quite like Caligula. The histories, written largely by his enemies, would have you believe he was a monster by birthright, a bad seed planted in the heart of Rome. But the truth is something far more complex and far more disturbing. Monsters are not born, they are made. They are forged in a crucible of trauma, terror, and a brand of survival that burns away the soul. This is not a catalog of a madman's crimes. This is a journey into the mind that conceived them. It is an exploration of how a little boy who survived the systematic annihilation of his family grew up to make the entire Roman Empire the stage for his own private nightmares. To understand the monster, we must first understand the boy. And that story begins not in a palace, but in the mud and grit of a military camp. His name wasn't even Caligula. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, a name brimming with legacy, with the weight of giants on his small shoulders. His father, Germanicus, was a beloved Roman general, the adopted son of the Emperor Tiberius, and the living embodiment of Roman virtue. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of the first emperor, Augustus himself, a woman of iron will and impeccable lineage. He was, by all accounts, a golden child, born at the apex of the world's greatest empire. But his nursery was not a quiet room in Rome. It was the frontier among the hardened legions of the Rhine. Germanicus, a master of popular appeal, would often dress his young son in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny hobnailed boots or caligae. The soldiers, rough and battle-scarred men, were enchanted. They nicknamed the boy Caligula, Little Boots. It was a term of endearment, a mascot's name. He was their living doll, a symbol of the future they were fighting for. But think for a moment what a child learns in such an environment. He learned the adoration of powerful men. He learned the rhythm of the march, the scent of leather, sweat, and spilled wine. He learned that violence was a daily reality, and that the men who wielded it could also be the men who showered him with affection. It was his first lesson in contradiction, that love and brutality could exist in the same space, wielded by the same hands. He was a prince surrounded by killers who adored him. This adoration was a shield, but it was a shield that would not last. The world outside the camp was a web of paranoia and political poison, spun from the cold, dark heart of the man who ruled the empire, his great-uncle, the Emperor Tiberius. The true forging of Caligula began with the slow, deliberate destruction of everything he loved. After his father Germanicus died under mysterious circumstances in Syria, a death many, including Caligula's own mother, blamed on the poison of Tiberius's agents, the family's gilded world began to crumble. Agrippina, proud and defiant, returned to Rome not as a grieving widow but as an accuser. It was a fatal mistake. In the suffocating political climate of Tiberius's court, guided by the venomous whispers of his praetorian prefect Sejanus, virtue was a threat and popularity was a death sentence. For a young Caligula, the world became a terrifying stage play of loss. The whispers in the palace corridors grew louder, a silence where there used to be laughter. The faces he loved began to disappear, one by one. First, his mother, Agrippina. A woman of unbreakable spirit, she was arrested, publicly flogged so viciously that she lost an eye, and exiled to the barren island of Pandateria, where she would starve herself to death in protest. Imagine a young boy hearing of his mother's fate, not in a soft whisper, but as a public spectacle of imperial power. Imagine the feeling of absolute helplessness. Then came his brothers. Nero Caesar, his older brother and heir apparent, was declared a public enemy, exiled, and driven to suicide. His next brother, Drusus Caesar, was imprisoned in the dungeons beneath the palace on the Palatine Hill, chained and starved to death so slowly, and with such calculated cruelty that he was found to have chewed the stuffing of his mattress to survive. Caligula was in Rome for all of this. He was a silent witness to the systematic eradication of his bloodline. He saw how the most powerful men in Rome, the senators, stood by and did nothing, their silence a testament to their terror. This was not just loss. This was a psychological blueprint being carved into his soul. Lesson 1. The world is a place of profound and arbitrary cruelty. Lesson 2. Trust no one, especially not those who smile at you in the halls of power. Lesson 3. Power is not about justice or virtue. It is about the ability to eliminate threats before they eliminate you. This sustained trauma, the constant fear of being the next to disappear, created a deep, festering wound of paranoia and rage that would never heal. His survival was a miracle of calculation. He was summoned to the island of Capri, the legendary retreat of the aging Emperor Tiberius. This was no honor. It was a gilded cage, a final test. Capri was not a center of government. It was a laboratory of depravity, a place where the most powerful man in the world had retreated from the duties of state to indulge in its darkest perversions. The histories, written by Suetonius and Tacitus, paint a chilling picture of life on that island. They speak of elaborate orgies, of children procured to serve the emperor's whims, of cruelty enacted as a form of entertainment. Caligula, now a teenager, was thrown into this snake pit. He was under constant observation, his every word, every glance, analyzed for signs of rebellion or resentment. One wrong move, one flicker of hatred in his eyes for the man who had destroyed his family, would have meant his immediate execution. So he learned a new skill, the art of the mask. He became, as the chroniclers noted, the perfect actor. He suppressed every natural feeling, every impulse for revenge, and mirrored the emperor's moods. He was subservient, attentive, and seemingly oblivious to the fate of his family. He wore a mask of absolute obedience, and behind it, he watched, and he learned. Capri was Caligula's true university. His professor was a paranoid, debauched tyrant, and his curriculum was the practical application of absolute power. He saw how Tiberius used sex not for pleasure, but as a tool of humiliation and control. He saw how the emperor delighted in breaking the wills of the proud, using their bodies to demonstrate his total dominance. He learned that for the man at the top, there were no moral boundaries, no ethical limits. The only law was the emperor's desire. He was a student in a master class of psychological warfare, witnessing firsthand how to turn human beings into objects, their dignity a plaything for the powerful. Imagine the psychological cost of such an education. He lived every day knowing he was a prisoner, surviving only by flattering his family's murderer. This experience cemented the lessons his trauma had already taught him. It confirmed that the world was a brutal, transactional place where the weak were devoured. It taught him that dissimulation was the key to survival, and that true power lay in the ability to inflict your will upon others without consequence. The furnace of his childhood trauma had melted him down, and the depraved University of Capri forged him anew. The sensitive boy known as Little Boots was gone forever, burned away in the fires of grief and terror. What was left was something hard, cold, and vengeful, a perfect instrument of tyranny, waiting for its moment to strike. The boy had learned his lessons well. The monster was now complete, waiting only for the death of his jailer to finally be unleashed upon the world. When Tiberius finally died, smothered by his own guards in a final act of political expediency, a wave of collective relief washed over the Roman Empire. The dark cloud of his reign had lifted, and in its place rose a new sun. Gaius Caesar, now 24 years old, the last surviving son of the beloved Germanicus, was proclaimed emperor. The people of Rome did not see the boy forged in the crucible of Capri. They saw the return of a hero's bloodline. They saw little boots. The celebration was ecstatic, a citywide festival of hope. Coins were minted with his image, his sisters honored, and his ascension was hailed as the dawn of a new golden age. For the first 7 months, Caligula played the part of the benevolent savior flawlessly. It was a performance so convincing that it's possible even he believed it. He was a master of the popular gesture. He paid out the legacies left in Tiberius's will, which the old emperor had intended to ignore. He burned the records of the treason trials that had destroyed his family, publicly declaring an end to the era of paranoia. He recalled exiles, reformed the tax system, and staged lavish games for the public. He was everything his father had been, charismatic, generous, and seemingly devoted to the welfare of the Roman people. The Senate, eager to curry favor with the new emperor, showered him with honors. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the trauma of his youth had been overcome, that the monster had been slain by the man. It was a false dawn. The turning point, the moment the mask began to crack and the true face of the man forged on Capri began to emerge, was an illness. In October of 37 A.D., just months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. The nature of the sickness is a mystery. The ancient sources are vague, describing it as a brain fever. It could have been encephalitis, epilepsy, or perhaps a severe nervous breakdown, the cumulative psychological weight of his past finally collapsing his mind. The entire empire held its breath. Vigils were held outside the palace. People offered their own lives to the gods in exchange for his recovery. And then he recovered. But the man who emerged from the sickbed was not the same man who had entered it. The ancient historian Suetonius claims this illness shattered his mind. Whether it was a physiological change in his brain or the psychological shock of a near-death experience, something profound had shifted. The carefully constructed facade of the benevolent ruler crumbled, and the lessons learned at the feet of Tiberius erupted with volcanic force. The performance was over. The unraveling had begun. His first target was the last vestige of his old life, his family. He forced his father-in-law and his cousin to commit suicide. He exiled his 2 surviving sisters, Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla. He seemed driven by a furious need to sever every tie to his past, to eliminate anyone who had known him as a mortal, as a victim. It was as if he was systematically destroying the evidence of his own humanity. And it was in his personal life, within the walls of the palace, that this new persona found its most shocking expression. The palace on the Palatine Hill ceased to be a center of government. It became a theater of degradation. Here, Caligula began to systematically dismantle every Roman moral and sexual taboo, not in private, but as a public spectacle. The most infamous of these transformations was the conversion of the imperial palace into what was, for all intents and purposes, a state-sponsored brothel. This was not a secret indulgence. According to the histories of both Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Caligula set aside a wing of the palace, furnished it lavishly, and staffed it with the wives and daughters of high-ranking senators and equestrians. Invitations were sent out as imperial commands. To refuse was not an option. Heralds were dispatched throughout Rome, advertising the new services of the palace to men of all ages and stations. this act was breathtaking in its audacity. It was a direct assault on the very foundations of Roman society. The Roman family, the domus, was a sacred institution, and the chastity of its women, particularly those of the upper classes, was a cornerstone of public honor. By turning these women into prostitutes, Caligula was not merely engaging in a personal vice, he was publicly castrating the Roman aristocracy. He was demonstrating in the most visceral way possible that their honor, their legacy, and the sanctity of their families meant nothing to him. He could take what he wanted, when he wanted, and he would make them watch. It was a lesson straight from the Tiberian playbook, magnified to an imperial scale. He was no longer just humiliating individuals in private. He was humiliating the entire ruling class in public. But the unraveling of his psyche went even deeper, into the last great taboo, incest. The Roman world was horrified by whispers of his relationships with his three sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla. He was said to treat them not as sisters but as wives, living with them in rotation. But his obsession centered on one, Drusilla. He adored her, and according to the sources, their relationship was that of a husband and wife, conducted openly at public banquets. When she died suddenly from a fever, his grief was monumental, unhinged. He declared her a goddess, the diva Drusilla, the first Roman woman to be deified. He made public mourning mandatory. To laugh, to bathe, or to dine with one's family was punishable by death. From a modern psychological perspective, this obsession can be seen as a deeply pathological response to his childhood trauma. Drusilla was more than a sister. She was one of the last remaining fragments of the family that had been stolen from him. In his shattered mind, the incestuous bond may have been a desperate, twisted attempt to reclaim a sense of family intimacy and security that he had been denied. By elevating her to a goddess, he was attempting to make her eternal, to ensure that this last piece of his original family could never be taken from him again. It was an act of profound love, filtered through the lens of profound madness. He was trying to heal the deepest wound of his past by committing the greatest sin of the present. His own marriages were a chaotic reflection of this inner turmoil. He was a serial bridegroom and adulterer. He attended the wedding of a prominent nobleman, Gaius Caesar, and midway through the ceremony was supposedly struck by the beauty of the bride. He stopped the proceedings, took the bride for himself, married her, and discarded her a few days later. He famously married the wealthy and promiscuous Lolia Paulina after hearing rumors of her grandmother's beauty, then divorced her because she was sterile. His final wife, Melonia Caesonia, was neither young nor beautiful, but she was, according to the historian Suetonius, a woman of reckless extravagance and wantonness. He loved her intensely, in his own possessive way. He would parade her naked before his friends and threaten to torture her to find out why he remained so faithful. On the day their daughter was born, he declared himself a father and the state bankrupt, immediately instituting new taxes to pay for the child's upbringing. The man, who had once been hailed as a savior, was now behaving like a predator. The boundaries between public and private, sane and insane, emperor and tyrant, had completely dissolved. His power was absolute, and he was now using it to externalize the chaos in his own mind. The 7-month golden age was a distant memory, a forgotten dream. The Roman people had prayed for their emperor's recovery, and their prayers had been answered. But the man the gods had sent back to them was a stranger, a creature of impulse and appetite, a ruler whose every whim became law, and whose every dark fantasy became a reality for the terrified citizens of Rome. The unraveling was complete. Now, the terror would be weaponized. To dismiss the reign of Caligula as mere madness is to miss its most chilling and methodical aspect. While his mind was undoubtedly fractured, Many of his most shocking sexual acts were not random fits of insanity. They were calculated, strategic, and aimed at a single target, the Roman Senate. His depravity was not just a symptom of his madness, it became its most effective weapon. To understand the political landscape of Caligula's reign is to understand his deep-seated, venomous hatred for the senatorial class. These were the men who had sat in silence, who had offered no resistance, while his mother and brothers were systematically destroyed by Tiberius and Sejanus. In his eyes, their cowardice was complicity. Their survival was an insult to his family's memory, and his revenge would not be a simple matter of executions. That was Tiberius's method. Caligula's revenge would be far more intimate, far more emasculating. He would not just take their lives, he would annihilate their dignity. The primary arena for this psychological warfare was the imperial banquet. In Roman culture, the banquet, or convivium, was a highly structured social ritual. It was where alliances were forged, status was displayed, and the intricate dance of power was performed. Under Caligula, the banquet was transformed into a theater of terror, and sex was his primary instrument of humiliation. The historical accounts from Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Seneca the Younger, all members or contemporaries of the senatorial class, paint a consistent and horrifying picture. Caligula would invite the most powerful senators and their wives to the palace. In the middle of the meal, the emperor would rise, and, as if inspecting livestock, would walk along the couches where the noblewomen were reclining. He would examine them critically, sometimes lifting their faces to the light, making comments on their physical attributes for all to hear. Then he would select one. He would lead the chosen woman away from the dining hall, often to his private chambers, while her husband was forced to remain at the table, smiling, drinking, and pretending that nothing was amiss. To show any sign of distress, a clenched jaw, a whitened knuckle, would be to sign your own death warrant. The minutes would stretch into an eternity of silent degradation. Then Caligula would return to the banquet with the woman in tow. This is where the true psychological torture began. He would recline back on his couch and proceed to give a public critique of the woman's performance in bed. He would announce to her husband and to the assembled guests every detail, every flaw, every point of praise for her endowments or her passion. Think for a moment about the sheer, calculated cruelty of this act. It was a multi-layered assault on the Roman male identity. A Roman aristocrat's power was tied to his dignitas, his standing, and his control over his domus, his household. Caligula systematically dismantled both. By taking the man's wife, he demonstrated his absolute power over the senator's property and lineage. By forcing the husband to watch and wait in silence, he reduced a powerful leader to a state of utter impotence. But by publicly critiquing the wife's sexual performance, he inflicted the deepest wound of all. He was not just cuckolding the man, he was publicly asserting his superior sexual authority, effectively castrating him in front of his peers. He was turning the most private aspect of a man's life into a public spectacle of his own dominance. It was a brilliant and sadistic form of political theater. This was not an occasional outburst. It was a pattern. He was known to have a list of high-born women whose names were kept in a register, treating them as part of an imperial harem. He allegedly had affairs with a staggering number of them, and his affairs were never discreet. They were public pronouncements of power. He had a particular fascination with the actress Mnester, a famous pantomime dancer. Caligula's obsession was so great that if anyone made a noise in the theater while Mnester was performing, he would have them dragged from their seat and flogged on the spot. He would kiss the actor publicly, a gesture that, for a Roman emperor, was a shocking breach of decorum. It was another way of demonstrating that his desires, no matter how unconventional, superseded all social norms. His use of sex as a weapon extended beyond the personal into the financial. Having squandered the vast fortune left by Tiberius through his extravagant building projects and games, Caligula needed to refill the imperial coffers. His methods were a blend of tyranny and perverse creativity. He imposed taxes on everything from lawsuits to porterage. Most infamously, he levied a tax on prostitution. This, in itself, was not unheard of. But Caligula's application was unique. He didn't just tax existing brothels. As we've seen, he created his own in the palace, effectively becoming the pimp-in-chief of the Roman elite. The message was clear: your women are my whores, and I will profit from their humiliation. His financial desperation led to other forms of sexual and social extortion. He began to hold public auctions at his residences, selling off old gladiators, palace furniture, and even personal effects of his family. He would compel the wealthiest senators to attend. During the bidding, Caligula would dictate who was to bid and for how much. He would supposedly point to a senator and declare, "You will bid 8,000,000 sesterces for that chair." The man had no choice but to comply. On one occasion, a senator dozed off during a long auction. Caligula turned to the auctioneer and said, "Consider the senator who is nodding his head to have just bought 13 gladiators at 9,000,000 sesterces." The man awoke to find himself financially ruined. These acts, while seemingly about money, were also about power and humiliation. They were another way of demonstrating his absolute control over the lives and fortunes of the men he despised. He was stripping them of their wealth just as he stripped them of their honor in the dining hall. It was all part of the same campaign of psychological annihilation. He broke their spirits with sexual degradation and shattered their financial security with arbitrary extortion. Even his relationship with his beloved horse, Incitatus, can be viewed through this political lens. The story that he intended to make his horse a consul is one of the most famous tales of his supposed madness. While it's unlikely he ever seriously intended to do so, the threat of it was the entire point. Incitatus was given a marble stable, an ivory manger, a jeweled collar, and a staff of servants. By lavishing such honors on an animal, Caligula was sending a clear, unambiguous message to the Senate. My horse is more important, more valuable, and more worthy of respect than any of you. To even suggest making a horse a consul was the ultimate insult. It implied that the highest office in the Republic, the position held by the most powerful men in Rome, could be performed just as well by an animal. It was a symbolic gesture that declared the entire political class obsolete and worthless. It was the logical endpoint of his campaign of humiliation, a final, absurd demonstration that in his empire, the only will that mattered was his own, and the established order of the world was nothing more than a toy for him to break. As Caligula's reign descended deeper into terror, he began to dismantle the final barrier that constrained him, the boundary between man and God. This was not a subtle, political evolution of imperial custom. It was a violent, obsessive delusion, a full-blown megalomania that would lead directly to his self-destruction. Having successfully weaponized sex to dominate the mortal world of the Senate, he now turned his ambition to the heavens. His logic, in its own twisted way, was absolute. If he possessed the power to create and destroy reality at will, to defy all human laws of morality and decency, then he could not possibly be a mere mortal. He had to be a god. The transformation began with his appearance. He started to appear in public dressed as various gods and demigods. One day he would be Hercules, complete with a lion's skin and a club. The next he would be Apollo, wearing a radiant crown and carrying a lyre. He even appeared as Venus, the goddess of love, dressed in fine silks. He was not merely honoring the gods, he was claiming their identities as his own. He built a private bridge connecting his palace on the Palatine Hill directly to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, the most sacred site in Rome, so that he could, as he claimed, have private consultations with the king of the gods. He would often be heard whispering to a statue of Jupiter, sometimes arguing with it, sometimes threatening it. He once supposedly told the statue, "Either you raise me up, or I will cast you down." This was his new reality. He was no longer an emperor serving the gods. He was a god demanding the service of mortals. He ordered the construction of 2 temples to himself in Rome, complete with a college of priests and the finest, most exotic animal sacrifices. The priests were not just any sycophants. He sold the positions to the highest bidders, forcing the wealthiest senators to pay exorbitant sums for the honor of worshiping him. His own wife, Caesonia, and his horse, Incitatus, were appointed as priests in his cult. The statue inside his temple was not a mere representation. It was a life-sized golden image of himself, which was dressed each day in a fresh set of the same clothes he was wearing. His divine madness was inextricably linked with his sexual depravity. If he was a god, then the rules of mortal men simply did not apply. His incestuous relationship with his sisters was no longer a crime. It was a divine right, mirroring the mythological unions of gods like Jupiter and Juno. He began to refer to himself as Jupiter Laetiaris, and insisted that his wife Caesonia be worshipped as Juno. His sexual exploits were no longer the whims of a tyrant. They were the divine privileges of a living deity. He would engage in public religious ceremonies that blurred the line between worship and orgy, further cementing the idea that his divine will was the only morality. This god complex reached its bizarre zenith in his relationships with the cosmos itself. On nights with a full moon, he would reportedly stand alone in his palace, inviting the moon goddess Luna to descend and lie with him. He would speak to her as a lover, a peer. This was the ultimate expression of his delusion. He was no longer bound by the earthly realm. He was a cosmic being, engaging in celestial affairs. His madness had expanded beyond the confines of Rome, beyond the human race, and into the very fabric of the universe. This delusion was the source of his most infamous military and political blunders, which read like scenes from a surrealist play. He marched the Roman legions to the northern coast of Gaul, supposedly to invade Britain. The soldiers were assembled, the invasion fleet was prepared. Then, at the last moment, Caligula ordered his men to halt. Their new mission, to wage war on the sea. He commanded them to attack the water with their swords, and to collect seashells from the beach as the spoils of a victory over Neptune. The soldiers, baffled but obedient, filled their helmets with shells, which were then transported back to Rome to be displayed in a triumphal procession. This act is often cited as the ultimate proof of his insanity. But within his divine worldview, it made a strange kind of sense. He wasn't just an emperor fighting a mortal king in Britain. He was a god asserting his dominance over another deity, the god of the sea. This divine certainty made him utterly unpredictable and terrifying. There was no logic to appeal to, no reason that could persuade him. His whims were divine proclamations. He would kiss his wife Caesonia's neck and whisper, "So beautiful a throat, and I can have it cut whenever I please." It was a statement of absolute power, the power of a god over a mortal's life. He famously wished that the Roman people had but one neck, so that he could sever it with a single blow. This was not the thought of a politician or a ruler. It was the thought of a being who saw humanity not as subjects, but as an undifferentiated mass, a plaything for his divine amusement. But the more he acted like a god, the more he reminded the mortals around him of his all-too-human capacity for cruelty. His reign of terror had alienated everyone. The people, who had once adored him, now lived in fear of his unpredictable taxes and executions. The military was humiliated by his absurd campaigns, and the Senate, the target of his most intimate cruelties, was simmering with a hatred that had finally reached its boiling point. He had slandered their names, stolen their fortunes, and raped their wives. He had left them with nothing to lose. The god had forgotten that he was made of flesh and blood. The end came swiftly and brutally. On January 24th, 41 AD, during a series of games held on the Palatine Hill, Caligula was walking through a private corridor. He was ambushed by a group of his own Praetorian guards, the very men sworn to protect him. The conspiracy was led by Cassius Chaerea, a tribune whom Caligula had relentlessly mocked for his high-pitched voice, often calling him Priapus, or girl. Chaerea struck the first blow. The others swarmed in. They did not just kill him. They butchered him, stabbing him over 30 times. The assassin's rage was a direct reflection of the humiliation he had inflicted. They even sought out his wife, Caesonia, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla. The child was supposedly seized by her feet, and her head was smashed against a wall. It was a final, horrific irony. The boy who had watched his family be destroyed to secure a tyrant's power had become a tyrant himself, only to have his own family annihilated in the very same way. His quest for godhood, his attempt to transcend the trauma and vulnerability of his mortal existence, had led him directly back to where he started, a bloody mess of flesh and bone, a victim of the same brutal politics that had created him. The god was dead. The monster had finally been put down. We have journeyed through the inferno of Caligula's mind, from the traumatized boy forged in a crucible of terror, to the tyrant who weaponized sex, and finally, to the self-proclaimed god who was brutally murdered by his own men. We have seen the evidence of his depravity, the catalogue of his cruelty, the ruins of a reign that burned so brightly and so terribly for just under 4 years. The story seems simple enough. A mad emperor got what he deserved. But here's the final, unsettling truth, the twist in the tale that complicates everything. Almost everything we know about Caligula, nearly every lurid story of incest, every tale of the palace brothel, every account of his sadistic dinner parties, was written by men who had every reason to despise him. The primary sources, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, Seneca, were all members or beneficiaries of the senatorial class, the very group that Caligula had systematically humiliated. They wrote their histories after he was dead and after his memory had been officially condemned by the Senate in a damnatio memoriae. They were, in essence, writing the victor's history. So, how much of the story is the unvarnished truth, and how much is propaganda expertly crafted to justify the assassination of an emperor, and to transform a complex and troublesome ruler into a simple, two-dimensional monster? The incest with his sisters? It could be a fabrication to paint him as fundamentally unnatural. The palace brothel? It might be a gross exaggeration of his unpopular taxes on prostitutes, spun into a tale of aristocratic degradation. The command to collect seashells? It could be a misunderstanding of a military term, or a story invented to make him look ridiculous. We will likely never know for certain where the man ends and the caricature begins. The histories have painted a portrait so monstrous that it is almost impossible to see the human being behind it. But this very uncertainty reveals the true legacy of Caligula. It is not just a list of potential crimes or a study in madness. It is a chilling warning about the nature of power and the narrative it creates. He shows us how absolute authority, unchecked by any institution or moral compass, can warp a human mind, regardless of its initial state. The trauma of his youth may not excuse his actions, but it provides a terrifying context, showing how a cycle of violence, once started, can perpetuate itself with devastating consequences. More importantly, the story of Caligula is a stark reminder that history is never a simple story of good versus evil. It is a battleground of narratives. When we are presented with a perfect monster, a figure of pure, unadulterated evil, we should always be suspicious. It is often easier to create a monster to hate than to confront the uncomfortable truth that tyrants are often just broken human beings, forged into weapons by a world that is itself cruel and broken. The story of Little Boots is ultimately a tragedy for his family, a tragedy for the countless victims of his reign, and a tragedy for the man himself. A man so consumed by the ghosts of his past that he became a monster to haunt the future. We are left with a portrait of a man who was both a victim and a villain, a madman and a shrewd political operator, a pathetic creature and a terrifying god. History is never a black and white affair. If you believe that digging into these complex, uncomfortable gray areas is essential to understanding not just the past, but ourselves, then join us on this journey. Subscribe, and let us know in the comments below. After hearing the evidence, do you believe Caligula was a born devil, or a broken product of a brutal world?